This is SG2 Perspectives, a conversation with industry experts and SG2 thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we all expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery. Welcome to SG2 Perspectives. I'm your host, Trevor Durin. This will be our third week of talking about the many impacts of COVID-19 on hospitals and health systems. Today's episode will have a pretty positive and hopeful tone, though, and that's not because we're starting to see the first positive data emerge about new infections plateauing or that the early signs of social distancing and sheltering at home may be working. Please continue to stay vigilant and stay home. This episode's exciting because we're talking with Soch and Chris Pagano about the many areas COVID-19 pandemic is forcing a quicker adoption and wider application of at the beginning of the year you guys highlighted as emerging technology disruptors to watch. You both are always so optimistic and excited about the future and the potential of new technology, so I'm not surprised you can see a bright light at the end of this really challenging tunnel. We'll start with you, Henry. This could probably be a 3-hour podcast if we let it, but we're not going to do that. So let's just pick a couple things that you're particularly excited about that you're seeing right now during the surge. And then later in the podcast, we'll talk about some things that we're expecting during reactivation, recovery, and monitoring.
Sure. Thanks, Trevor. So I think you're right. I think when we highlighted our disruptors to watch back in January, I think we were pretty excited about highlighting those technologies. I don't think that we had very much expectation that they were going to accelerate to the rate that they have. I think that if you look at the three technologies that we talked a little bit about artificial intelligence, we talked about infinite computing, and we talked about synthetic biology. What's been encouraging to me has been the role of the maker community. So 3D printing has been really encouraging to watch that maker community come together in light of the shortages that our healthcare workers are facing around personal protective equipment. I've been really encouraged about how the maker community and the 3D printing community has come together to share resources, to post online open source 3D printing of things like face shields. So here in Connecticut, where I live, a number of the community colleges came together. They actually transported all of their 3D printers to a single location so they could co-locate all that equipment even as the kind of shelter in place and social distancing went into place. And they're printing out for the local communities in the tri-state area around here, they're printing out face shields. And they're cranking them out at a rate of, a couple of thousand a day. That's been pretty encouraging. There has been open source 3D printing of replacements for N95 masks. So there was a open source 3D printing instruction that was put out there to allow you to 3D print a mask that you could essentially take a vacuum cleaner HEPA filter and cut a filter and insert it into this so that you could wear this plastic 3D printed face mask with the appropriate filtration to protect healthcare workers. So I guess that'd be the first point that I was really interested to see accelerate. And I think that we're going to continue to see that. The other big issue around that one was the 3D printing of mechanical connectors that allow health systems to be able to use one ventilator on multiple patients. So printing those T connectors and other connectors to allow you to hook up more than one patient to a ventilator to try and mitigate some of the shortages of the ventilators was another kind of resource that 3D printing brought to the forefront here. So that was kind of number one. The second one was around the concept that we talked about in terms of infinite computing. And what's been used around this one has been kind of the tracking movement. Google has put out a scorecard by state of how well the citizens in the state are complying with the social distancing and not moving around. So I just checked Connecticut's numbers today. A week ago, we had a C. Some of the folks in Fairfield County down closer to New York, some of the folks up in the northwestern corner of the state, you could see from their GPS data that they were still doing a lot of moving around. When I checked again this morning, that grade has increased to a B. So I don't think we're doing everything that we should be doing perfectly yet, but I think the ability to be able to kind of provide some real-time visualization to how well citizens are complying with some of the stay in place and social distancing thing, I think is important. The other area where this idea of machine learning and infinite computing has been put into place has been to look at severity of illness and try and identify, using some of these artificial networks and machine learning networks, which Chris will talk about in just a minute, which patients have the potential to get worse, which ones we might consider releasing into a shelter-at-home isolation type environment. So that's been another application of kind of infinite computing. And the third one is the issue of kind of personal sensors. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit later on, but this idea of how do we use personal sensors to track what's going on in the home? I've been following Ochsner Health and their virtual health team and their digital health team. They have been deploying a device from a company called TytoCare that has a stethoscope on it, that has an otoscope on it, that has a tongue depressor on it, that can look at ECG. They've been deploying that to some of their patients to allow them to monitor for conditions at home, obviously keeping those patients out of the ED, helping to kind of decant some of the volumes that they're looking at. So those two areas of 3D printing and infinite computing, I think, have been very encouraging in terms of how the industry has stepped up to help us take a look at how we manage this disease going forward.
That is really encouraging. And I'm accustomed to hearing, particularly from Chris, because we sit near each other when we're sitting in the office, all the possible things that AI can do. But just this morning, I heard from a former health system CFO who was talking about how important AI might be in flu season 2020, 2021 for early identification and targeting high-risk individuals. So Chris, why is AI so exciting right now?
I think to your point, it's been very interesting to see how artificial intelligence not only has been able to support the overarching response to the COVID-19 crisis, but frankly, if we rewound the tape here a little bit, the reality is it could have perhaps headed this off at the pass in some ways. It's been relatively well publicized at this point, but great startup up in Canada called Blue Dot. They have created an artificial intelligence capability that actually is able to scour huge amounts of data sets from all around the world and very proactively identify areas of concern. So back in the end of December of last year, they actually started to raise the alarms that there was something coming out of Wuhan in China that was concerning. At the time, they basically said there's some sort of strange flu. Of course, now we know it's not a flu, but that was coming out of that region that was concerning. And it wasn't for a few more weeks that the CDC and the WHO actually became public in their pronouncements that there was a potential emerging crisis coming out of that area. And I think one of the lessons we've learned over the last handful of months is how big a difference a week can make. So just thinking about the fact that there was an artificial intelligence that was way ahead of the game in terms of identifying this issue before it was really more widespreadly known is something to think about. More recently, Data Miner in New York, right? They've developed an AI that they're saying is able to predict where the next spike in COVID-19 is going to be. They've already identified 14 areas across the country, many of which have unfortunately already been tracking quite closely with their projections. And so I think to your point, how are we going to think about utilizing artificial intelligence of this type in the future, whether it be to perhaps get ahead of the curve around future pandemics or, to your point, right, we have an oncoming flu season. How can we identify hotspots around the country utilizing artificial intelligence and more proactively deploy capabilities? Other areas where AI, certainly comes to mind here in terms of the response, we've seen AI being utilized using natural language processing capabilities to actually scour all of the different research out there. There's a great project called the Semantic Scholar Project that actually comes out of Allen Institute of Artificial Intelligence up in Seattle that's doing exactly that. So really trying to think through how can we operate efficiently and frankly go through all the research for potential solutions to this challenge and any types of therapeutics that might be beneficial at frankly a rate that a human being could never do. More practically, we've seen Providence St. Joseph do some incredible work around developing rapidly in conjunction with Microsoft, an online screening tool that uses artificial intelligence to really accelerate a lot of the triaging they were able to do, I believe, a little bit above 40,000 patients in their first week, putting them through that process and being able to rapidly differentiate between those who very likely had COVID-19 and those that didn't. So certainly that has been tremendously beneficial to them. And we've seen other organizations like Partners up in Boston and others actually adopt a similar mentality and approach to utilize their clinicians more efficiently. Certainly that's critical given the shortages that we've seen all around the country. We've seen AI. We talked about this actually, as Henry mentioned before on our Disruptors podcast, the ability to have it read CT scans. Well, now we're seeing that capability applied to this situation in terms of AI that can actually read CT scans for lung tissue damage. Certainly thinking about how do we utilize our imaging specialists as effectively as possible. And then, maybe the last point to touch on here would be DeepMind, right? So I should probably say Google's sister company, so Alphabet subsidiary, they developed AlphaFold, which for those who follow this is their AI that actually predicts the 3D structure of different proteins based on its genetic sequencing. They applied that capability to COVID-19. And the hope is that in doing so, they maybe are able to accelerate the research community's ability to develop a vaccine. Certainly that approach also has longer term implications in terms of just accelerating the ability to bring drugs to market across the board. So a lot of activity going on in this space, but certainly those are the areas that I've certainly been tracking closely.
Those things are all making an impact right now during the surge. What about what comes next? We're urging hospitals and health systems, particularly planning teams, to start thinking about and planning for and building scenarios and contingencies around reactivation when they're going to restart, and we'll put air quotes around normal hospital and health system business. So what are some developments in new and emerging tech that we're seeing are going to play a big role in this phase?
To my mind, it touches back on something Henry brought up, which is the idea of individual sensors. And to me, that, of course, is very much in line with remote patient monitoring in general. And I think we've been talking about for quite a while the idea of the patient as the point of care, really trying to think through how can organizations better support patients, no matter where they are geographically, in their home, in their community, or elsewhere. I think we're going to really see that accelerate here. And it actually raises some interesting opportunities, of course, but some challenges as well. So how do you think through as an organization managing those massive data sets? How do you balance the ability to act proactively based on the actionable insights you're getting from all of these different data sources, but also thinking through patient privacy as well? And I think that there's going to be a very large discussion. It opens up this debate here around how do you balance the benefits, both from a clinical perspective and frankly from a public health perspective, between safety and proactive care and privacy. We already, as Henry mentioned before, have seen indications that Google, and I would add the US government, is utilizing location data from smartphones to track individuals. I think a more accelerated version of this we've seen in China already. They've developed AI that can actually rapidly identify patients who have a fever, even if they're in a crowd. And so when you think about those ideas in combination with contact tracing, there's a balance here. A lot of people are pushing to try to restart up the economy, and this discussion around being able to identify and more finitely monitor specific individuals who have developed COVID-19 or maybe are at disproportionate risk to do so. There's going to be a discussion here around how do we find the right balance there. And I think hospitals and health systems, frankly, are going to be at the center of a lot of that conversation. And a lot of times they don't have all the data that they need to be able to do that well. So how do we think through data management? How do we think through security? What is the role of the provider in that conversation? And I think these are the types of conversations we're going to be having moving forward as we start to restart normal hospital and health system business.
Whew. And just like we're hopeful it'll be hard to reverse the rapid change in telehealth regulation, it's going to be really tough to reel back in any monitoring capabilities that we allow governments, tech companies, or health systems to have now in the face of this crisis. So I can see really compelling arguments on multiple sides of the discussion there. So thanks, Chris. Now, Henry, when we released our Disruptors to Watch, there was another area that could play a huge role in the treatment and suppression of COVID.
The other component that we talked about back in January was synthetic biology. And I think that what we have already seen in terms of a response to this crisis from the life sciences industry has been the move towards trying to find a vaccine or trying to find some type of a treatment for this. And so the idea of synthetic biology, I think, is going to revolutionize kind of what's going on in the life sciences industry. If the recommendations or the thought process from some of the drug manufacturers are correct, that they hope to have a vaccine for this in 12 to 18 months, stop and think about what that means when we think about typical drug discovery from 10 to 15 years and costing billions of dollars. What's helping us get to this new reality is the whole topic of synthetic biology and the infinite computing thing. They work together. So if you stop and think about the fact that now with machine learning, many of the drug companies have already identified through the use of machine learning and what we talked about in January around these generational adversarial networks, the ability to model which areas do we look at, which are the prime targets for developing a drug or a vaccine to be able to mitigate some of the challenges with COVID-19. And so they can do, using these big networks, they can run through millions of scenarios and identify thousands of potential targets that they can go after in a very short period of time. And then what they can do is model on the computer what the impact of implementing a targeted drug or a therapy around this will do to humans. So we're pretty familiar with kind of the concept of in vitro testing, test tube, kind of in the lab, in vivo testing in humans or in animals. There's another term that we're going to need to become familiar with, and that is in silico testing, which is testing on a computer. So now we don't have to worry about sacrificing animals to do drug testing. You don't have to worry about necessarily submitting humans to a trial that might have an adverse effect for them. A lot of this can be done in the computer. And so I think, again, you can use these generational adversarial networks to kind of model thousands of different areas that we can look at for targeted drug therapy. And once we get to that point, and once drug companies become familiar with that process, I think that this kind of 10 to 15 year timeline at billions of dollars, we're going to see that revolutionize drug discovery and deployment to a state that we haven't seen before. And that's very encouraging, not only for handling the reemergence of kind of our economy after this disease, but also in the planning phase for what might come next. So I'm very encouraged about that as well.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, I'm encouraged too. I'm always encouraged hearing from both of your optimism. And as I expected, you can see a light at the end of this very challenging tunnel. So here's the last question. What's one thing we haven't seen yet? And it's okay if you speculate here, something that could emerge maybe 12 months or more down the road.
I'll start with that one, Trevor. I think that one of the things that we haven't seen yet, but is already kind of under consideration, is the idea of the genomic sequencing of this virus and subsequent viruses. Dr. Jennifer Doudna, who is one of the discoverers of CRISPR technology at the University of California, Berkeley, has already shifted the emphasis or the focus of her lab to doing the genomic sequencing of the COVID-19 virus and getting the sequencing done with that. And also then looking at, is there a way for us to use CRISPR technology to be able to edit that virus to either inhibit its ability to be able to latch on to some of the proteins in the human body or mitigate the impact that it might have once a person is infected with it. So I think that that's an encouraging sign. I don't think we're there yet. I think that that's kind of 12 to 18, maybe 24 months away. But our ability to be able to use this tool of CRISPR technology to be able to actually edit the genome of the virus itself and be able to kind of inhibit the spread, maybe inhibit the severity of the illness, and also to use the information that they get from that sequencing of the genome to identify what the best target is to be able to kill it. once a patient gets it. That goes hand in hand with the vaccine development. That'll take a little bit longer, I think, than from everything I've heard from the professionals out there, than an initial vaccine. But I think that's something that holds tremendous promise for us in dealing with these pandemics in the future. And the other good news is that community around CRISPR technology is sharing all the information. They are on weekly calls together globally through the World Health Organization and the other countries who have been severely impacted by this pandemic to share that information and make it as widely available as possible. So I'm very encouraged about that too.
I'll say this. Certainly, I completely agree with Henry. I think that what is coming down the pipeline here in terms of genomic sequencing is incredibly impactful and will be certainly something that we continue to monitor closely. The other one that I would offer is perhaps a little bit more mundane, if you will, but I think is going to be tremendously impactful, and that's drones, right? So this is not an idea that's necessarily new. We've seen a lot of organizations across the country already thinking through how can we utilize drones to move different types of supplies throughout the supply chain in a more efficient way. But what's been interesting is seeing abroad how drones are being used during this crisis. So in China, we know that we've seen testing that's being done, being moved from the testing site rapidly out to the lab to be processed using drones. I think if you start thinking through some of the earlier discussion around home health that we were having, and how much care is actually going to be migrating into the home. And we're already seeing how actually people are quite able to adapt to doing, a huge amount of activity in their home to begin with. And I'm already starting to hear some people say that they appreciate some of the aspects of that. The reality is that as at-home diagnostics become more sophisticated, as more care is able to be delivered directly into the home, and then again, as we're thinking through how do we actually monitor individuals in their home and then act proactively and provide that care, a big part of that is going to be providing medications, again, those different types of monitoring devices and where appropriate, different types of testing into the home in an effective and efficient way. And I think a big part of the answer around that is going to be drones. So certainly drones, I think, is the area that I'm keeping a close eye on. Probably, not going to be widespread in the immediate future, but if I'm thinking 12 to 24 months out, I think we might start to see that really actually take hold.
Yeah, that's a good one, Chris. I wish a drone could deliver a dinner tonight or maybe groceries. It's tough to get on those delivery windows. So this is, as expected, been really hopeful and promising that truly many of these exciting areas will get a much needed nudge forward in the face of this crisis. So thank you both, and I really look forward to talking to you again soon. This has been another great episode of SG2 Perspectives, where industry experts and SG2 thought leaders explore the drivers of tomorrow's healthcare strategies to inform today's decision makers. Contact us anytime by sending an email to sg2perspectives@sg2.com. We'd love to hear from you. SG2 revolutionized healthcare demand forecasting with the Impact of Change forecast, and today we're the industry's premier strategy advisory firm. To learn more, visit sg2.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you again soon.